Last episode, I told you where we were headed next. I said we were going to take a trip to Midian, and that it looks surprisingly like Canada. Well, today I make good on that, because this one's personal, and I've been sitting on it for a while. This is going to be all about Nightbreed, Clive Barker's 1990 monster epic. The film Morgan Creek didn't want you to love. The movie that got sold to you as a slasher flick when it was actually something far stranger and a lot more sincere. And 20-something years after I first rented it from a Blockbuster Movies in Atlanta, Georgia, it's the film I'm finally going to tell you actually happened to me, not just a character on screen. Fair warning up front, this is a longer one. There's a whole studio butchered production history to try to get through, and a fandom that spent 20-odd years refusing to let that butchering be the final word. And then a part of this that isn't really about the movie at all. Get comfortable. Buckle in. There's a lot of movie here, and even more underneath it. Let's start with what Barker was actually trying to do. You know, horror has a general rule that's older than the genre's name. The monster is the menace. Malicious or misunderstood, sympathetic or not, the monster is the thing the story is defending you from. Even the ones we love, Frankenstein's creature, the Wolfman, Dracula himself, the camera still frames them, eventually, as something that has to be stopped. Clive Barker looked at that rule and asked a different question. What if the monster is the one worth rooting for? Full stop, no asterisk. Not what if the monster has a sad backstory. Horror had already done that plenty of times, right back to Carlos' creature crying by the fire. Barker's move was bigger and stranger. He built the monster an entire civilization, a home, a hierarchy, a god, a culture with its own laws and its own history, and then asked you to actively want it to survive the humans that were coming to burn it all down. Nightbreed was one of the first films to do that at scale. Before Hellboy had a whole bureau of misfit monster agents, before Buffy and Angel and True Blood built entire mythologies of civilized monster society living quietly alongside us, Barker built Midian, an underground city of exiles hidden beneath a graveyard with its own laws and its own god, a demigod protector called Baphomet. And here's the argument I want to make today. Understanding the monster is really one of two things: understanding yourself or understanding the thing you've been taught to fear. Either one is useful. Barker built an entire film, and as we'll get into it, an entire fandom fought for decades just to make you do both at once. Think about how many horror icons only get to be sympathetic after they're already dead or defeated or safely locked back in the ground. The creature from the Black Lagoon gets one tragic look before the harpoon. Larry Talbot gets one anguished plea before the silver bullet. Horror will let a monster be sad. It very rarely lets a monster win. Nightbreed doesn't just let the monsters be sad. It hands them the entire moral center of the film and dares you to keep rooting for the humans anyway. Spoiler, most people who've seen it can't. Let's go back to where it all started. Not the film, but the book. Nightbreed didn't start as a screenplay. It started as a novella called Cabal, published in 1988 as part of Barker's sixth and final Books of Blood collection. A short, sharp book, deliberately. Barker's talked about wanting Cabal to read like a fragment of a much bigger epic. Quicksilver, impressionistic, each character sketched in a few strokes rather than fully rendered. Like you were catching flashes of something enormous rather than being handed the whole thing. He even invented fake quotes, attributed to fake authors, scattered throughout the text. Footnotes to a mythology that doesn't actually exist anywhere else, just to make Midian feel like it had history longer than the book itself. Which is either a genuinely clever bit of world building or the most elaborate. The novella's plot is tighter and colder than what eventually reached the screen. Aaron Boone, the main character, has visions of a place called Midian, a refuge where whatever you'd done, real or imagined, gets forgiven. His psychiatrist, Decker, is secretly the serial killer terrorizing the area and manipulates Boone into believing that he's the one responsible. It's a leaner, more clinical version of the story. Boone and his girlfriend Lori barely even have a relationship on the page. The film would eventually have to build an entire emotional through line the book never bothered with. Morgan Creek, the studio, same one about to cause us a lot of grief in a few minutes, insisted on a friendlier title for the film version. The first of many small concessions that snowballed into a much, much bigger problem. And if you ever track down the novella itself, a few character fates land differently than they do in the movie, you might know. Lylesburg survives in the book. Narcisse doesn't. In the theatrical cut, he lives. In the novella, and later the director's cut, he doesn't. Small details, but they tell you something. Even Barker's own studio-approved theatrical version was already drifting from his original intentions before a single reshoot happened. What the novella already has, though, untouched and unwatered down, is the line this whole episode keeps circling back to. Monsters who can fly, who can transform, who've defied death, and the humans who secretly envy them for it. That's the seed. Now let's talk about who Barker got to help him grow it. If you want proof Barker wasn't interested in doing this the easy way, look at who he put in front of his camera. Dr. Philip K. Decker, the film's human monster, the psychiatrist secretly responsible for the killings that Boone gets blamed for, is played by none other than David Cronenberg. Not primarily an actor, a director. A horror auteur in his own right, with his own body horror pedigree, playing the one character in this entire film who doesn't need a single prosthetic to be terrifying. The story goes he was cast specifically for how reserved and composed he could be. The scarier your on-screen psychiatrist looks like your actual psychiatrist, the worse the reveal lands when the mask comes off. It's a genuinely inspired bit of stunt casting dressed up as a straight-faced acting choice, and it works precisely because nobody involved is winking at the camera about it. On the other side of that equation, you've got the breed themselves. Oliver Parker as Pelican, the creature who bites Boone and kicks off his transformation, Nicholas Vince as Kinski, and a whole underground population of creature performers and practical prosthetic work built to make Midian feel like lived in rather than just glimpsed through a doorway. And then there's Ralph McQuarrie. Yes, that Ralph McQuarrie. The concept artist who designed the entire visual universe of the original Star Wars trilogy, plus E.T., Star Trek IV, Cocoon. He joined this production near the tail end of shooting, specifically to paint mats and a single sprawling mural depicting the full history of the Nightbreed. 60 feet of it, according to people who've seen it in person. McQuarrie himself described it as, in his words, a chronicle, a kind of catalog of these creatures. It's right there in the film's opening credits, if you know to look for it. Here's the part that actually stops me. This was his last screen credit. After a career that shaped how several generations pictured outer space, McQuarrie closed out his filmography painting the family tree of a bunch of monsters that a studio executive was actively afraid audiences would like too much. His concept work didn't stop at the mural either. Production art and miniatures he designed for Midian's graveyard entrance have turned up at auctions a decade later, still credited to him by name. Make of that what you will. I choose to read it as one more piece of evidence that everyone who actually worked on this film understood exactly what they were building, even when the people funding it didn't. And this was supposed to be the first of 3 films, a trilogy where the doctors and the policemen, horror's oldest heroic archetypes, were recast as the villains, and the freak got to be the one worth saving. Of course, that trilogy never happened, and here's why. Before we get into the wreckage, I want to sit with this for a second, because it's easy to skip past on the way to the juicier studio villain material coming up. Barker didn't just want to make one movie about Midian, he wanted 3. An entire arc, expanding the world we only get a glimpse of in the version that actually reached the theaters. More of the breed, more of their history, more of Baphomet's mythology, More room for the doctor and policeman as villain idea to actually breathe across a trilogy instead of getting crammed into 102 minutes. Think about what horror looked like by the time franchises like this became normal. The Conjuring universe, the Hellboy films. Barker's own idea would eventually influence anyway entire streaming series built around exactly this kind of monster society world building. Barker wanted to do that in 1990. He had the pitch. He had the first film mostly shot. What he got instead was a studio that got scared after one test screening and made sure there'd never be a second film to worry about. We'll never get those other two movies. Barker had to let Midian's fuller story live mostly in the margins, in the novella and later comics, and in the version of the film fans eventually rebuilt by hand. It's worth remembering, as we get into exactly how that first film got torn apart, that we're not just talking about the one bad edit. We're talking about the death of an entire planned mythology, strangled in the crib. After Hellraiser made Barker a name in horror, he had every opportunity to just make Hellraiser 2 and call it a career move. He didn't want to. He said outright he wanted to do something for monster movies that nobody had done. Give them mythological scale, a platform to argue their own case, rather than another round of pinhead one-liners. So he picked the story ambitious enough to let him try, and set about building an entire underground world to house it. A hidden city beneath a graveyard, with its own culture, its own god, and its own rules for who belongs and who doesn't. Take a second and sit with how strange and sincere a swing that is for a horror follow-up. Makers write a hit by doing the exact same thing again, but slightly bigger. Barker built a whole civilization instead, and put a fellow horror director in the villain's chair to do it. And he built it somewhere genuinely strange for a Hollywood monster movie, in the wilds of Alberta, Canada, chosen specifically for how remote and unpopulated it was. Which, fun fact for anyone who caught last week's teaser, yes, that's the joke. Midian really does look surprisingly like Canada because it is Canada, dressed up in fog machines and prosthetics and a small fortune's worth of practical creature work. Nobody was CGIing their way out of budget problems in 1989. Every single one of those breed extras is a real person, in a real suit, standing in real Canadian cold, committing completely to being a monster nobody in the marketing department believed audiences could love. Which makes what happened next hurt a little more. Most of what I'm about to tell you comes from one place. A 2012 Rue Morgue interview where Barker, Mark Miller, and Cabal cut editor Russell Charrington sat down and actually walked through what happened. So credit where it's due up front. That interview is doing a lot of the heavy lifting in this next stretch. Short version, the way Barker tells it, after an early screening, a studio executive's reaction amounted to a warning that Barker needed to rein things in because people in that room were starting to root for the wrong side. That's not a note. That's the whole point of the film, and the studio treated it like a bug instead of the feature. So they reshot it, re-edited it, pushed the release out of a planned 1989 summer slot and into February of 1990. About as quiet a month as a studio can bury something in. Then they sold what remained with an ad campaign that marketed Nightbreed as a straight-up slasher film. The exact opposite of what it actually was, aimed at exactly the audience least likely to enjoy it. In that same interview, Barker talks about what the process did to him personally, and it's not something I want to rush past. He describes the theatrical cut as visibly built for a completely different film. Long, patient tracking shots that only work when played in full were gutted once the recutting started. He talks about watching his editor, Mark Goldblatt, stuck between protecting Barker's vision and following instructions from whoever was actually paying him. Not an easy spot for anyone to be in, by Barker's own account. He calls it the single worst creative experience of his life, and in his own words, he was vomiting daily, and both his health and his personal life suffered for it. He compares his fans to his own childhood self, carefully building an Aurora Frankenstein model kit and staring at it every day. and says he felt like he'd failed every one of them, even though it wasn't for lack of trying. The reviews, when they landed, were brutal. Barker remembers one critic putting it plainly, "I like my monsters evil." And he actually respected that response in a strange way. At least that critic was honest about wanting something in the film that he had no intentions of giving him. But Barker's own comeback to that critic is the better argument, and I happen to agree with it completely. His point, roughly, audiences sided with the monster forever. Dracula outlived the men chasing him with stakes. Pinhead is more famous than Kirsty Cotton. Michael Myers cast a longer shadow than Laurie Strode. Nightbreed didn't invent the instinct to root for the monster, it just stopped apologizing for it. Barker also mentions that the first genuinely positive reviews came out of Japan, and that this was the first moment he felt like enough of his actual film had survived the recutting for someone to actually notice what he'd been going for. Stop and think about how strange that actually is for a second. A British horror novelist, underground monster civilization, filmed in Canada, financed by an American studio, gets its first real understanding from critics on the other side of the world. The same audiences who'd go on to make things like Guyver and the entire kaiju and tokusatsu's traditions mainstream. Maybe monster civilizations just travel better in translation. Back to the film. Within weeks of release, Nightbreed was gone from the theater. By most studios' math, that's the end of the story. But it wasn't. Being decades ahead of what audiences are ready for has one upside. Eventually they do catch up. It just took a while, and Nightbreed's while has been a genuinely long one. Flip through recent critical coverage of this film, and the tone has completely flipped from 1990. When Arrow put together their loaded 4K restoration, the disc carried fresh critical appreciations specifically built around reassessing the film properly. Extended pieces from critics like Kim Newman and Kat Ellinger, walking through exactly the argument I've been making this whole episode, that this was never really a slasher film that failed. It was a monster epic that got sold as one by people too scared to market what they had actually funded. That's the culture, 3 decades late and a little embarrassed about it. Admitting the executives who worried people would sympathize with the monsters were right all along. He just had the moral of the story backwards. Nightbreed found a second life on VHS, the way a lot of the best cult horror films do. And with it, persistent rumors of missing footage that could be used to rebuild the film Barker actually shot before the studio got to it. Mark Miller, who'd go on to co-head Barker's own Seraphim Films, tells this part of the story himself in that same Rue Morgue piece. Short version, he was a fan first, poking around online, looking into Barker's work, and stumbled onto the forum chatter about footage nobody had officially released. So he did the only logical thing. He messaged Clive Barker directly and just asked what the deal was. Barker filled him in. Miller volunteered to help track it down, and by his own description, he spent the whole search feeling like an adventure archaeologist chasing down lost treasure. Except the temple in question turned out to be a shelf in Barker's actual house. Because that really is where the footage was. Not a vault, not a studio archive, just sitting in Barker's own storage closet, tucked behind years of collected toys and the old film canisters, just waiting for someone to go looking. From there, a film lecturer named Russell Charrington took over the reconstruction, spending months rebuilding the film from Barker's earliest scripts and the original novella, deliberately ignoring every later revision the studio forced through, and even pulling Danny Elfman's official soundtrack back in by ear to score footage that had barely any usable sound. The result, eventually called the Cabal cut, ran only 4 minutes longer than the first full assembly. Barker's own notes on it, watching it back, came to 4 minutes on a 2.5-hour movie. Apparently, Charrington understood the assignment. A quick word on that score, because it deserves one. Elfman was, at that point, right in the middle of becoming the defining horror-adjacent composer of his generation. Beetlejuice behind him, Batman the same year as Nightbreed's release, Edward Scissorhands right around the corner. His Nightbreed score is genuinely gorgeous, sweeping and mournful in a way that argues for Midian's tragedy better than some of the dialogue does. The fact that a fan editor, working from a dusty VHS workprint with barely any usable sound, could grab that same official score off of a CD and cut it back in scene for scene and have it work is honestly a small miracle of ear and patience. None of that would have gone anywhere without the fans pushing from outside, though. A campaign called Occupy Midian organized thousands of people. A Facebook following past 5,000. An online petition that crossed 8,000 signatures. More than a dozen fan-organized screenings around the world. And slowly, visibly, turned Morgan Creek from a studio that wanted nothing to do with this film into one willing to let it be seen properly again. And Charrington mentioned one more thing in that interview. A fallback plan, in case the actual footage had never turned up. A process where you take the old tapes, bake them at a controlled temperature for roughly a week straight, and then get exactly one high-quality playback out of them before they're gone for good. One shot permanently. That's exactly how far people were prepared to go for a movie that a studio executive once wanted buried because the monsters were too easy to like. 20-some years of fans refusing to let a studio's cowardice be the final word. That's not nothing. That grassroots pressure is, in a very real sense, the reason we eventually got an official director's cut at all, and the reason Arrow Video could put together the genuinely loaded 4K restoration sitting on store shelves right now. And when I say loaded, I want to walk you through this because it's a little bit insane. Both cuts of the film, the 102-minute theatrical version and the 121-minute director's cut, in glorious 4K with HDR and Dolby Vision. 3 separate commentary tracks, 2 feature-length documentaries, interviews, 18 deleted and alternate scenes, 2 trailers, 2 TV spots, 9 image galleries, including, I kid you not, the complete original shooting screenplay scanned in full for anyone who wants to read the movie Barker actually wrote before a single studio note touched it. There's also, and I promise I'm not making this up, a scrapped stop-motion test reel, matte painting test footage, a monster masterclass with the creature designer, and a music video for a song called Johnny Get Angry on a horror disc set. Nobody asked for that. Somebody clearly loved this film enough to put it there anyway. And the 3 commentary tracks aren't just Barker talking to himself for 2 hours either. One pairs him with restoration producer Mark Allen Miller. One puts critic Kim Newman and Stephen Jones alongside Barker collaborator Peter Atkins. And a third sits Miller down with the director's cut own editor to walk through exactly how the reconstruction actually got assembled, technically scene by scene. That's 3 entirely different conversations about this film, and none of them redundant. That's the whole arc in miniature. A studio that once tried to strangle this movie in its crib eventually greenlit a box set that treats it like the Criterion Collection treats Bergman. 20 years of persistence can do that. Here's a quick bit of trivia myself the first time I went down this rabbit hole. The official director's cut that eventually made it into the loaded Arrow disc is not the same thing as the original Cabal cut. Charrington's Cabal cut, the one built from work prints and Barker's earliest scripts, the one that restores the novella's original ending, runs about 155 minutes, and to this day exists mainly as the fan reconstruction that started the whole movement. It predates the official version, and it's not quite what eventually got the Arrow release. It rebalances the entire film so Boone and Laurie's relationship sits at the emotional center rather than Decker's murders. The official director's cut that followed is a bit more compressed than that, 121 minutes rather than 155. A studio-sanctioned middle ground between the theatrical butchering and Charrington's full fan reconstruction. Both matter. Both exist because people refuse to let one bad edit be the final word. But if you ever hear someone casually say the Cabal cut and the director's cut like they're both interchangeable, now you know better than they do. Before we head into where all this landed personally, it's worth naming what Nightbreed kicked off, because it's bigger than one cult movie's afterlife. Nightbreed was one of the first films to give monsters a genuine civilized society on screen. A society with laws, hierarchy, a shared culture, a place they call home rather than a cave they hide in between kills. That idea didn't stay contained to one underrated 1990 film. It's the direct ancestor of Hellboy's entire Bureau for Paranormal Research and Defense, full of monsters working the day job of protecting the humans who'd otherwise burn them at the stake. It's there in Buffy and Angel's demon bars and neutral ground rules. It's there in True Blood's entire premise of monsters stepping out of hiding into civil society, messily, publicly, but on their own terms. Barker didn't invent monsters with feelings. Horror had those for decades. What he actually built was monsters with infrastructure. And an entire generation of genre television has been quietly living in the house he built ever since, usually without crediting the landlord. Which brings me to the part of this episode that isn't really about the movie at all anymore. Nightbreed came out in February of 1990. I missed it on its first release. I had other things going on that year. I was busy planning my escape strategy. That was the year I left Charlotte, North Carolina, left the relative comfort of a life I already knew and a first relationship that had run its course, to go make my own way, to go find my own people in Atlanta, Georgia. I rented Nightbreed on video that first summer on my own in Atlanta from the local Blockbuster. And it wasn't a perfect movie. I want to be honest about that. It still isn't. But I couldn't help but finding myself in it. Aaron Boone leaves behind the life he knows and ends up somewhere underground, hidden, full of people the rest of the world has already decided were monsters. A place of refuge. A place where whatever you've been told was wrong with you gets forgiven, or just doesn't matter anymore. I've joked for years that my friends and I always referred to Atlanta as the island of misfit toys. And I showed up there with next to nothing. No plan, really just a burning need to make it my home and to live fully, out and proud, on my own terms for the first time in my life. My Midian turned out to be Midtown Atlanta. My breed lived and worked and played at alluring places like the Atlanta Eagle, the Cove, Piedmont Park, and Bulldogs. Real places, not a hidden city under a graveyard, but it did the same job Midian did. It's where I found affinity among thousands of other gay folks who'd made their own way there from all over the Southeast. All of us having left some version of the same small life behind. I spent 20 mostly happy years in Atlanta before moving west to be with my partner Billy after 2 long years of long-distance romance. The last time I visited, the city had grown and changed so much that I even barely recognized parts of it. I haven't been back in years now, and I'm sure it's changed even more. But it will always be a home to me, the first one I ever chose for myself. And the people I knew and loved back then are still there, living and thriving, waiting with open arms. I know that many have left the city and or this earth, but in my heart, they are all alive and well in Midtown. I didn't go looking for permission to read this film the way I do, but it turns out Barker already gave it to me decades ago in an interview he did when the Cabal cut was finally getting its due. In that Rue Morgue interview, Barker didn't talk about visual effects or runtime when he was asked how it felt to finally see this version of the film exist. He talked about what the story actually was to him, and he called it the closet where the homos live, and said the doors needed throwing open. And then he said something I think about a lot, that he still believes that after all these years. That's not me reading something into a movie about monsters that happens to flatter my own story. That's the person who made it, on record, telling you flat out what it was always about. So when I tell you Midian turned out to be Atlanta, Georgia, I'm not stretching a metaphor just to make it fit. Barker built the metaphor on purpose, years before I ever rented that tape. I just happened to walk through the door he had already left open. And maybe that's the real through line of everything we've talked about today. So where does that leave us? It leaves us with a novella that started as a fragment of something bigger, deliberately, a director who cast a fellow horror auteur to play the most human monster in the film, a trilogy that never got to happen, and a mythology we only ever got a fraction of. A studio that got scared of exactly the thing that made the movie good and spent a small fortune making sure nobody could see it properly for 20 years. Critics who finally, decades later, admitted the film was right the whole time. A fan campaign that started with one guy texting Clive Barker like he was sliding into his DMs and ended with a 4K steelbook stuffed with more special features than most Oscar winners get. And an entire genre of monsters with infrastructure TV that owes this film rent that it's never going to pay. And underneath all of that, for at least one horror kid from Allendale, South Carolina, by way of Atlanta, a story about finding your own underground city that turns out not to be fiction at all. And thus we end our visit to Midian. Next time on Baz to the Bone, we'll dive deep into the glitter and glam of the Phantom of the Paradise, Brian De Palma's 1974 American rock musical comedy scored by and starring Paul Williams and the ever-lovely Jessica Harper. The plot loosely adapts several classic works, including the 16th century Faust legend, Oscar Wilde's The Picture of Dorian Gray, and Gaston Leroux's 1910 novel, The Phantom of the Opera. Baz to the Bone is produced bi-weekly here in Cardiff, Wales, with the help of two incredibly unhelpful cats. And if you want more of this, you can find the show wherever you get your podcasts. If you're enjoying the podcast, please take a moment to rate and review us on iTunes. It only takes 30 seconds, and it genuinely helps more people find the show. If you want to further support what we're doing here, join our Patreon at patreon.com/BazToTheBonecast. The link is in the show notes, along with every film, person, and publication mentioned in this episode. I'm your host, Baz, and this has been Baz to the Bone, where we do horror, cult film, and bad taste properly. Now go find your own private Midian and send me a postcard. I'll see you in a fortnight.